The marble walls echoed with silence as the remark dropped, sharp, dismissive, cutting. Justice Barrett smirked, her voice still lingering in the air like a gavel strike no one had expected. For a heartbeat, the courtroom froze.
Ow!
Glanced up from their notepads. Attorneys shifted in their seats. Even the spectators seated high in the gallery leaned forward, sensing that something unusual had just pierced the chamber's rehearsed civility. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but stings. The silence, after power, has spoken. After authority has made its presence known, Barrett carried herself with the practiced certainty of someone who knew she commanded the room. The robe, the title, the marble setting, all of it seemed to conspire in her favor, magnifying the weight of every word she dropped. But then, across from her, sat Jasmine Crockett. No robe, no centuries-old institution draped around her shoulders, just her voice, her fire, and her will to stand her ground. To the casual observer, she looked outmatched. One woman pitted against the towering figure of a Supreme Court justice, an institution personified in human form. Yet those who knew Crockett understood that appearances were often the biggest trap. Underestimation was the air she had breathed her whole life, and it had never suffocated her. It had sharpened her. The reporters could feel it too, and pens hovered. Cameras zoomed in, waiting to see if Crockett would flinch or fold. That was the script history had written for so many before her. Deference, compliance, quiet. But Crockett's eyes told a different story. The story of someone who wasn't about to play by those rules. Barrett's smirk lingered as if the matter were already settled. Yet even in her confidence, there was a shadow of blindness. Power often mistakes silence for surrender. What Barrett and almost everyone else in that room hadn't realized was that this silence wasn't defeat. It was the inhale before fire. Few realized they were about to witness one of the most unforgettable exchanges in recent courtroom history. A moment not just of words but of worlds colliding. The establishment against the insurgent authority. Against defiance, dismissal against dignity, and because when Jasmine Crockett finally replied, the entire room shifted. The hearing had been scheduled as just another item on Washington's endless calendar, one more debate over policy, precedent, and power. But everyone in that chamber knew the stakes were far higher. Cameras were rolling not only for the official record, but for every platform where millions would later dissect each word. The nation had grown weary of polished statements and scripted exchanges. People wanted raw moments of truth, something that broke through the sterile choreography of politics. On this day, they got more than they bargained for. At its core, the proceeding was about authority, who wielded it, who questioned it, and who was allowed to challenge the narrative of America's future. Justice Barrett represented the permanence of the system, decades on the bench, power cloaked in tradition, decisions that ripple through generations. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett embodied something different, a restless energy, the urgency of voices historically silenced, the determination to demand that America live up to its promises. For Crockett, the moment carried weight far beyond policy. She was a black woman, a representative, and the daughter of a community that had been told too often to wait its turn. She knew the cost of speaking up in rooms designed to mute dissent. Every word she spoke risked ridicule, headlines, and the wrath of those who saw her audacity as trespass. Yet every word she withheld risked something even greater, the quiet erasure of the people she had sworn to represent. It was a clash that transcended to individuals. On one side, the marble, the robe, the institution, centuries of entrenched hierarchy. On the other, a woman armed with nothing more than her conviction and the burning insistence that America's democracy was not meant to be ornamental, but alive, pulsing, and accountable. The cameras captured Barrett's practiced poise, but they also caught the tightening of Crockett's jaw, the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't there to be a footnote. She was there to etch her voice into the very stone of that chamber. The symbolic weight was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about a legal interpretation or a procedural dispute. It was about identity, voice, and the audacity to exist unapologetically in spaces that had long pretended not to hear. It was about whether dignity could speak on equal terms with authority, whether truth could pierce through layers of privilege and power. This wasn't just about a question. It was about who gets to speak for the people. And as the minutes ticked on, the air grew charged. Journalists shifted in their seats, sensing the possibility of a headline that would reverberate far beyond Washington. Staffers whispered, eyes darting between the two women. Even those who tried to maintain composure felt it in their bones. Something bigger than politics was about to break open. Barrett, with her steady gaze and rehearsed calm, seemed to relish the mounting tension. She had seen challengers before, watched them falter under the weight of her authority. Crockett, however, did not blink. She carried the pressure not as a burden, but as proof of why she was there. Every ounce of condescension in the room only strengthened her resolve, and then Justice Barrett leaned forward with the comment that sparked fire. To understand the weight of the clash, one must first understand the figure of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. In the halls of America's highest court, she is seen as polished, deliberate, and untouchable. Every move is measured, every word carefully chosen, as if she were not simply speaking in the present, but engraving her thoughts into history. She carries herself with a confidence that comes from years of navigating institutions built to reinforce authority. Her robe is more than fabric, it is armor, a shield against challenge, a symbol of permanence. Her rise was as swift as it was controversial. Plucked from the appellate bench, Barrett ascended to the Supreme Court under the most heated of circumstances. For her supporters, she was the embodiment of conservative ideals, principled, devout, a jurist they believed would defend tradition against the tides of progress. For her critics, she represented the culmination of a political strategy that had stacked the court with those who could tilt the nation's destiny for decades. Either way, she became an unavoidable figure, young by judicial standards, sharpened by years of academia and legal rigor, and aware of her place as one of the most influential voices in America's legal order. Barrett's judicial philosophy is cloaked in the language of originalism, a commitment to interpreting the Constitution as it was understood at the nation's founding. To some, this signaled discipline and restraint. To others, it symbolized rigidity, a refusal to acknowledge the lived realities of modern America. Behind the legal jargon lay something more visceral, a reputation for sharpness, for slicing through arguments with a mix of intellect and dismissiveness that could leave challengers visibly shaken in the courtroom. She projects serenity, but beneath it lies an edge, the quiet blade of someone who knows she cannot be easily rattled. Her questions to lawyers are often surgical, designed not only to probe the law, but to expose weaknesses, to remind everyone of the asymmetry of power between the bench and those who stand before it. She has perfected the art of the smirk, the almost imperceptible smile that suggests she has already won the exchange before the other side has finished speaking. This aura of untouchability, however, carries with it an unspoken flaw. When power is so accustomed to reverence, it begins to treat dissent as noise rather than substance. Barrett, like many who sit on high pedestals of authority, has often underestimated those who confront her not with polished legalese, but with raw conviction. Her record reveals moments of cool dismissal toward voices that challenge her worldview. Advocates who spoke with urgency about civil rights are marginalized. Communities often found their words reflected back in her restrained, sometimes skeptical tone, as though emotion itself were evidence of weakness. That tendency toward dismissiveness was not lost on those who followed her career. For admirers, it was framed as discipline, the mark of a jurist unmoved by theatrics. For critics, it was the quiet cruelty of indifference, the refusal to acknowledge that lived experience could ever rival precedent. Either way, the pattern was clear. Barrett rarely expected to be shaken, and when challengers dared to confront her, she seemed to lean on the certainty that authority alone would carry the day. This is what made the hearing with Jasmine Crockett so electrifying. Barrett entered the chamber with the same poise she had worn in countless exchanges before, calm, unflappable, radiating the confidence of someone who had never truly lost control of a room. She was the institution incarnate, centuries of tradition behind her, the power of precedent at her fingertips. And in her mind, the exchange to come was just another test she was destined to pass with ease. But power has one blind spot. It never expects to be outshined in its own arena. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name was etched into headlines, she was a daughter of Texas, raised in a world that never handed her anything without a fight. Growing up, she learned quickly that her voice had to work twice as hard to be heard. Her parents instilled in her the value of persistence, the dignity of labor, and the belief that silence in the face of injustice was never an option. She carried those lessons with her through school hallways where she was underestimated, into college classrooms where professors doubted her, eventually into courtrooms where opposing counsel often assumed that her youth, her gender, or her skin color would make her falter, were always wrong. Before politics, Crockett's battleground was the law. As a public defender, she met clients who were written off by society. People who didn't have the money, the connections, or the privilege to shield them from the system's harshest blows. She became their voice, often the only barrier between them and a system designed to forget their names. The long nights, the impossible castle loads, the constant pushback from prosecutors and judges, it was there she developed her trademark fire. She realized that her sharpness wasn't a liability, it was her weapon. The one thing that ensured the voiceless were not erased without a fight. That same fire carried her into politics. Running for office was never supposed to be easy, and for Crockett, it certainly wasn't. She faced ridicule, coded language, outright attacks. She was told she was too inexperienced, too brash, too unapologetically herself. But each insult was fuel. Every time someone tried to put her back in the box of quiet compliance, she stepped out even louder. She didn't run for the approval of gatekeepers. She ran because her community needed someone who understood their battles, someone who wouldn't flinch in rooms designed to intimidate. Her journey was paved with moments of confrontation, each one a rehearsal for the stage she would one day share with Justice Barrett. There were the debates where opponents tried to belittle her, only to be silenced by her quick wit. There were committee hearings where colleagues rolled their eyes at her questions, only to realize she was the only one brave enough to ask them. There were interviews where pundits framed her as too angry, too emotional. Yet those same emotions drew supporters who finally felt represented. Crockett understood what it meant to be dismissed before she even opened her mouth. She also understood the power of refusing to shrink. Her presence was more than politics. It was defiance embodied. She didn't apologize for her accent, her volume, her style, or her passion. Every part of her that critics tried to weaponize became part of her armor. The louder they tried to drown her out, the stronger she spoke. It was this history, this archive of battles fought and survived, that prepared her for the moment inside that marble courtroom. When she walked in, she knew she wasn't just carrying her own name. She carried the names of the people who had stood behind her in elections, the clients she had defended when no one else believed in them, the young women watching who needed proof that fire could stand toe-to-toe with power and not be extinguished. Her very presence in that chamber was already an act of rebellion against the idea that only certain voices belong. Yet Crockett was not there to merely exist. She was there to confront, to prove that defiance, when rooted in justice, could be just as legitimate and just as commanding as institutional authority. And so, as the hearing unfolded, every glance toward her, every murmur questioning why she was there, only strengthened her resolve. This wasn't her first fight, but it would become her most unforgettable. So when Barrett's words landed, Crockett didn't shrink back. She leaned in. The words fell from Justice Barrett's lips like polished stone, smooth, deliberate, and meant to leave no room for rebuttal. Her tone was coldly confident, the kind of cadence that carried an unspoken message. This is final. This is settled. The smirk that had begun earlier now deepened ever so slightly, as if daring anyone in the room to challenge her authority. It was the language of power, honed by years on the bench, wrapped in the certainty that her word was not just argument, but law. The audience felt it instantly. Some leaned back in their chairs as though the remark itself had landed a blow. Others leaned forward, hungry for what might come next. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, every shuffle of paper, every hushed exchange of whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing that this wasn't going to be another sterile, forgettable hearing. Something was stirring beneath the marble calm, and at the center of it sat Jasmine Crockett. Her body remained still, but stillness did not mean silence. Her eyes fixed on Barrett, unflinching. There was no trace of retreat, no hint that she would allow herself to be boxed in by tone or title. To the untrained eye, she seemed composed, but those who knew her history understood what that composure meant. It was the calm before fire. Barrett pressed on, her voice cutting across the chamber with the same assurance that had disarmed so many challengers before. The more she spoke, the more she radiated certainty, as if the mere weight of her words could extinguish dissent. But Crockett gave nothing away. She let the silence work for her, a silence that grew heavier with every passing second. Even the spectators in the gallery began to sense it. This was not the silence of surrender. It was anticipation. The tension began to build like a storm cloud. Each passing moment stretched taut, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Barrett glanced up briefly, perhaps expecting to see deference in Crockett's eyes. Instead, she found resolve, steady, unyielding, the kind of resolve that could not be bent by smirks or robes. A ripple passed through the room. Someone in the back audibly gasped when Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, her posture shifting with the weight of what was about to come. The reporters' pens froze. The cameras adjusted their focus. Even Barrett seemed to pause, perhaps sensing that her authority had brushed against something immovable. For an instant, time seemed to slow. The authority of the robe, the marble, the centuries of precedent pressed down on one side. On the other, Crockett's voice, not yet spoken, but already felt, rose like a gathering wave, ready to crash, and then with the nation watching. Crockett unleashed her reply. It began not with fire, but with control. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush her words, didn't allow Barrett's sharpness to force her into defensiveness. Instead, she let the silence breathe, as if every second of waiting pulled the room further into her orbit. The pause became power. Reporters held their pens above the page, frozen midair. The audience leaned forward, unsure of what was about to break. And then, with her voice steady but unmistakably charged, Crockett began. "Justice Barrett," she said, her tone clipped, but clear, "I respect the robe you wear. I respect the history that seat represents. But respect is not the same as silence. And you cannot dismiss my community, my people, or my voice with a smirk." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Barrett's expression barely shifted, but the faint lift of her chin betrayed surprise at the directness. Few dared speak to her in such terms. Yet Crockett pressed forward, her words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years she had spent being underestimated. "You sit there as if this institution makes you untouchable. But the truth is, every decision, every ruling, every word you utter impacts real lives. People who don't have your privilege, people who don't get the benefit of a system designed to protect them. And when you dismiss dissent as though it's beneath you, you don't just belittle me. You belittle the very idea that democracy belongs to all of us." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Some nodded, others exchanged glances of disbelief. A staffer in the corner whispered, "She actually said that." Unable to contain the shock, Barrett shifted slightly in her chair. Her smirk wavered, just for an instant. She leaned back, then forward again, as if searching for the right posture, to reassert her dominance. But Crockett was not giving her room to recover. "Understand this," Crockett continued, her voice now rising with unmistakable cadence. "I didn't come here today to play by the script. I didn't come to sit politely while you wave away the realities my constituents live every single day. I came here because people are tired of being invisible, tired of watching decisions made in rooms like this by people who've never had to live with the consequences." The words landed like drumbeats. Every pause between them was filled with the electricity of the audience's reaction. Few reporters, usually disciplined into poker faces, couldn't hide their astonishment. One mouthed, "Wow." Another shook his head, scribbling furiously. Barrett raised her hand slightly, as though preparing to interrupt. Gott caught the motion short with a sudden burst of conviction. "You don't get to silence me. Not today. Not when my very presence here proves that the voices you ignore will always find a way to be heard." The room shifted. The authority that had clung to Barrett at the start of the hearing now seemed to seep toward Crockett. She spoke with the kind of certainty that institutions cannot fabricate, a certainty born from struggle, from carrying entire communities on her back. Barrett opened her mouth, perhaps to reclaim the floor, but Crockett pressed on, her timing impeccable. "You wear the robe, but I carry the people. And believe me when I tell you, Justice, the people are louder than precedent, stronger than procedure, and far more enduring than a smirk." A shockwave passed through the chamber, heads turned toward Barrett, waiting for her reaction. For the first time, she seemed rattled, her eyes narrowing, her lips tightening. The confidence in her body language replaced with the faint trace of unease. It was as if she suddenly realized the robe could not shield her from the truth burning. Across from her, Crockett, sensing the shift, let the silence return. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Barrett, and dropped her final words like thunder. "So you can dismiss me if you want. But understand, I am not here alone. I am the voice of millions who will never sit in that chair, but who deserve to be heard all the same. I will not let you or anyone erase them." The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once. Some in the gallery clapped before quickly stifling themselves. A reporter audibly whispered, "That's it." Quote, even a few aides on the sidelines exchanged looks of quiet admiration. Barrett's smirk was gone. In its place lingered a tightened jaw, the barest flicker of acknowledgement that she had been outmaneuvered. Not by another justice, but by a congresswoman, who refused to shrink in her shadow. Crockett leaned back, her face calm, her body language unshaken. She had not shouted. She had not lost composure. She had wielded her conviction with surgical precision, turning every condescending glance, every dismissive tone, into fuel. And in doing so, she had flipped the entire energy of the room. What had begun as Barrett's arena now belonged to Crockett. The reporters, the audience, even those watching later on screens across the nation, they would not remember Barrett's smirk. They would remember the moment Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through centuries of marble silence and left authority, itself unsettled. It was a mic drop, the kind of exchange destined to be replayed, quoted and remembered long after the hearing ended. But the impact didn't stop inside the courtroom. It erupted across the nation. The moment, Crockett's words, landed, the courtroom may have held its breath, but the outside world did anything but. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were uploaded, clipped, subtitled, and shared. By the time the hearing adjourned, hashtags were already trending. Hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag Smirk No More, and hashtag Voice of the People on Twitter. The feed moved like wildfire. One post, replaying the line, "You wear the robe, but I carry the people," was retweeted tens of thousands of times within the hour. Memes exploded across timelines. Barrett's smirk frozen next to Crockett's fiery stare, GIFs looping the precise moment the room shifted. TikTok creators layered her words over swelling music. Slow motion edits, captions that turned a courtroom exchange into cinematic storytelling. Celebrities quickly joined the chorus. An actress posted, "This is what courage looks like." Crockett didn't just speak, she shook the marble. A Grammy-winning musician tweeted the now iconic line with a raised fist emoji. Late-night hosts were already scripting their monologues, sensing that this was a cultural moment too big to ignore. Pundits split sharply along familiar lines. Progressive commentators hailed Crockett's performance as a defining moment, calling it a necessary disruption of institutional arrogance. One viral editorial declared, "In a chamber designed to silence, Crockett turned the volume all the way up." Conservative voices, by contrast, labeled it disrespectful, undignified, even dangerous. Yet even their critiques only amplified the reach of the clip, ensuring more people saw it for themselves. News cycles latched on. Morning shows played the footage on repeat, inviting panels to debate its significance. Headlines declared Crockett stuns courtroom, smirk meets its match, and voice versus robe. Who won? Cable networks dissected her body language. Barrett's reaction, the audible gasps from the gallery. For 24 hours straight, the exchange dominated airtime, overshadowing every other political story. For young activists, the moment became more than news. It became a rallying cry. Instagram feeds filled with stylized graphics quoting Crockett's words, framed in bold fonts and bright colors. College students shared clips in group chats, calling her the mic drop queen. High school debaters replayed her cadence for inspiration. Even those outside politics felt the impact. It wasn't about law. It was about defiance. It's about the right to speak without apology. In congressional halls, the ripple effect was just as palpable. Allies praised her openly, while rivals quietly recalibrated. One lawmaker admitted off camera, "She showed us all that Barrett can bleed." Another whispered, "No one will underestimate her again." Crockett had shifted not only the energy in the courtroom, but the calculus of Washington's power games. The cultural moment crystallized in viral edits. Someone spliced the footage into a mock movie trailer, Barrett framed as the immovable authority, Crockett as the underdog hero, ending with her thunderous line in the caption, "Coming soon, democracy strikes back." Millions watched, laughed, shared, and nodded with pride. It was more than entertainment. It was catharsis. For communities long accustomed to watching leaders swallowed by decorum, Crockett's refusal to bow felt like vindication. For immigrants, women of color, and anyone who had ever been told to wait their turn, it was proof that defiance could break through the marble walls of tradition. As the sun set that evening, it was clear this was no longer just a courtroom exchange. It was a cultural reckoning, a spark catching in the collective imagination. Crockett hadn't just spoken back to power. She had reminded the nation that authority could be questioned, even shattered, when met with courage. Yet the most powerful response wasn't online, it was in the streets. When the dust began to settle, one truth lingered in the air thicker than any headline, thicker than any partisan spin. What had unfolded wasn't just a battle of personalities. It was a confrontation between two visions of America, one that leans on authority as its shield, and one that rises on dignity as its power. Jasmine Crockett, standing in that chamber against the full weight of centuries-old tradition, had reminded everyone watching that dignity is not handed down from a robe, nor certified by marble walls. It comes from speaking truth when truth is most inconvenient, from defending voices that would otherwise be erased. That was the quiet revelation of her defiance, in a room built to silence. She proved that courage could be louder than precedent. For many, her words struck like a mirror held up to the nation. Who are we? When faced with arrogance disguised as certainty. Who are we when told to accept silence in the face of dismissal? Crockett's stand suggested an answer. We are at our best not when we bow to authority, but when we lift each other with truth. The contrast was undeniable. Barrett's smirk, calculated, polished, meant to diminish, had come to symbolize the old guard, the reflex of institutions, to preserve themselves at all costs. Crockett's reply became something far more enduring, the affirmation that this country, for all its flaws, still belongs to its people, and that the voices least expected to matter often carry the deepest resonance. It wasn't just about one courtroom or one exchange, it was about every immigrant child told they don't belong, every woman whose voice was dismissed in a boardroom, every community fighting to be heard beyond statistics and headlines. Crockett stood not as an exception, but as an embodiment of them all. Her words turned personal struggle into public declaration. You cannot erase us. That's why the moment transcended politics. It became patriotic, in the truest sense of the word. Patriotism is not blind deference. It's a devotion to the ideals that make a nation worth defending. Crockett's mic drop rebuttal wasn't rebellion. For its own sake, was a reminder that democracy survives only when arrogance yields to accountability. Truth outshines lies when dignity stands taller than dismissal. And so the question echoes, what kind of America do we choose to be? One that clings to authority as a weapon, or one that dares to let every voice matter? Crockett's stand dared us all to decide. This wasn't just a debate, it was a mirror of who we want to be. And as history remembers that night, one truth remains. Justice Barrett clashed with Jasmine Crockett, and in that clash, something unforgettable was born. What began as a smirk meant to dismiss, ended as a reply so sharp, so dignified, that it stunned the courtroom and shook the country. The marble walls will remember the silence after Crockett's words. But more importantly, so will the millions who watched and felt their own voices carried in her defiance. This was never just about one hearing or one exchange. It was about the timeless struggle between arrogance and courage, between authority that silences and dignity that refuses to disappear. Barrett may have worn the robe, but Crockett carried the people, and in the end, that was the louder power. The lesson is simple, but profound. When truth stands its ground, arrogance falters. When courage refuses to shrink, even the strongest, institutions must listen. And when one voice dares to rise, gives permission for countless others to follow. That is why this moment matters, not only because it stunned a courtroom, but because it reminded us of the country we want to be, a nation where dignity speaks louder than dismissal, where truth outshines arrogance, where no voice is ever too small to matter. If moments like this matter to you, don't just watch history, share it, subscribe, and be part of it. Because the clash that stunned the courtroom is more than a headline. It's a call to believe, to speak, and to carry forward the truth that can outshine any smirk.